let's talk about Hellraiser. So, we got more news on the new movie that is happening. Big news is that they have cast Jamie Clayton to play Pinhead or the Hell Priest in the new Hulu movie of the new Hellraiser. And Clive Barker is now producing. So, this is huge news. Two reasons, actually, multiple reasons. First of all, we're gender flipping Pinhead. So we're having Jamie Clayton play Pinhead. We're going with female Pinhead, which I think is amazing for obvious reasons. But doubly amazing, Jamie Clayton, trans actress. So now we have a trans actress playing one of the most iconic horror villains in cinema history. I love this. This is great. So Jamie announced this on her Twitter here. Demons to some, angels to others. Hulu Hellraisers. There she is with the Leviathan box. So there's going to be a lot of people who are obviously upset by this, as they usually are when anything gets gender swapped or anything basically upsets their nostalgia. And there's reasons why all of their complaints are going to be illegitimate. So I've been diving into a bunch of Hellraiser history. I'm going to go into it with you guys. So first off, let's go back to the original films. So the important thing to note is the history of Hellraiser and how we got to how we are here. So the first four movies, Hellraiser 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4, which are a little bit lesser, they were all done by New World Pictures, Roger Corman's production company. And then they folded. And the rights basically went up for grabs, at which point they got grabbed by Dimension Films, owned by Harvey and Bob Weinstein. And they held on to the rights for a long time, making a whole slew of films. Now, the deal that the Weinsteins had at Dimension for Hellraiser was basically a use it or lose it licensing agreement. So as long as they continued to make Hellraiser movies, they would continue to own the rights to Hellraiser. If they stopped making them within a certain time period, that means the rights reverted back and they lost them. So what they did was, instead of putting Hellraiser films into development and production, what they did was take a lot of little horror scripts that came along and they were developing and turn those into Hellraiser movies. So basically, with Hellraiser 5, 6, 7, and 8, all of those movies did not start out as Hellraiser movies. They were completely different movies. And they're like, by the way, can you make this a Hellraiser movie? Because then we can hold on to the rights to Hellraiser and we can sell it on the back of Hellraiser and Pinhead. And that's what happened. And that's why those movies are kind of weird and don't really fit into any coherent mythos or narrative within the Hellraiser world. Some are better than others. Some of them are pretty bad. Actually, one of my favorites, I did a massive rewatch of all 10 films recently, which got increasingly masochistic, and maybe that's appropriate for Hellraiser, but Hellraiser Deader, I thought actually had some really interesting stuff in it. It had a couple of really cool scenes, and I could see what they were doing. And while it isn't a good Hellraiser movie, it was actually a pretty decent little horror movie. And actually, I think it's worth a watch. 9 and 10 actually were created as Hellraiser movies. But the problem is that they were created so ridiculously cheaply and fast, again, just so that Dimension could hold on to the rights, that they are really bad movies. And for these two movies, 9 and 10, these are the movies that Doug Bradley, who plays Pinhead or the Hell Priest, did not return for. And that's mostly because, A, the films were garbage, and he didn't want to do it anymore, and 2, that they offered him a ridiculously low amount of money to return. They basically offered him $1,000 per film to come back and play Pinhead again, which he said, no, I've got better things to do, and did not return. So already Pinhead is being replaced in casting for both those movies. They're played by two totally different actors. So that gets to where we are now. Dimension Films, of course, kind of languishing. The Weinsteins basically out of the business at this point. Surprisingly enough, I found out the Weinstein Company is still operating, but the Weinsteins are not involved and have no stake into it. And it's basically a finance bureau that's taken control of the company, is continuing to develop projects. Why they're still calling it the Weinstein Company? I don't know. Seems kind of bad. It's like saying, what's the problem with naming my business the Jeffrey Dahmer Steakhouse? I don't see any problem with that. That's just bad PR, in my opinion. Anyways, back to Hellraiser. So, this is where the entire franchise basically ends up at this point. And now we have a new film that's basically in development, which is the first film which has any real intent behind it for being an actual good Hellraiser film. And we're getting casting as well. And of course, the what we're doing with the Hellraiser film is that they're going back to the original novel, Clive Barker's novel, Hellbound Heart, and doing a retelling of that story. They're trying to do a faithful retelling of that story, but in basically a new light, which is cool. So what did I do? I went out and I picked up a copy of Hellbound Heart. I haven't read this in I don't know, 15 years or so. And I wanted to dive back in and see what we saw. And so I just wanted to read a quick passage from here. This is the description when we first see the Cenobites in the story. "What city is this?" one of the four inquired. Frank had difficulty guessing the speaker's gender with any certainty. Its clothes, some of which were sewn to and through its skin, hid its private parts, and there was nothing in the dregs of its voice or in the willfully disfigured features that offered the least clue. When it spoke, hooks transfixed the flaps of its eyes were wed by an intricate system of chains passed through flesh and bone alike. The similar hooks through the lower lip were teased by the motion, exposing the glistening meat beneath. "I asked you a question," it said. Frank made no reply. The name of the city was the last thing on his mind. "Do you understand?" the figure beside the first demanded. Its voice, unlike that of its companion, was light and breathy, the voice of an excited girl. Every inch of its head had been tattooed with an intricate grid, and every intersection of the horizontal and vertical axes a jeweled pin driven through to the bone. Its tongue was similarly decorated. "Do you even know who we are?" it asked. "Yes," Frank said at last. "I know." So that's the introduction of the Cenobites in Barker's original novel. Now, depending on how you want to read that, you could say the first lead Cenobite was, intended to be like what essentially became Pinhead in the films, and is identified as basically being genderless, being unable to determine from the voice whether Pinhead was male or female, having no identifiers as the sex. It's basically a non-binary character. Or you can go with the second Cenobite we are introduced to, which is very visually clearly meant to be Pinhead, because that's how it's described, with the grid tattooed on the face and the pins driven into the bone at each axis. That is clearly the visual aesthetic of Pinhead and is identified very strictly as female in the story. So, whichever way you cut it, there is an argument here for going to a female Pinhead when you go back to the source material. Now, the other thing is to dive back to the original films, is that originally the intention was for 1 and 2, which are essentially one story. But with the second film, the Julia character, who basically returns from hell and is one of the larger villains in the second film, the intent was at the end of the movie that she was supposed to become the original Queen of Hell. And she was essentially supposed to, starting in the first film, be essentially the scorned lover of Frank, who gets pulled into the situation. And then by the end of the second film, she ends up ruling over hell. Now, the actress who played Julia was not enjoying the movies and did not want to return and continue the character, and basically asked to be killed off. So that's why that did not happen in the second film. But that was the original intent, that essentially it was going to be a woman that was going to be ruling hell in the Hellraiser movies. Again, going back to our original intent. So The last point I'm going to go to is the Hellraiser comics that continued. Now, these are comics that were actually written by Clive Barker for Boom Studios. And in it, they tell a storyline where Pinhead is basically doing what Pinhead does, going around, coming out of the box when people open it, tearing them apart. And he is bored. He is sick of it. It is all just very tedious to him. So he says, enough. I tire of all this bloodletting. I'm bored. Sermon service, I wonder, and what to whom. And he just wants to go on to a new experience. And he basically asks Leviathan in hell to essentially become human again. And to do so, he has to find a suitable replacement. So enter in Kirsty Cotton, who was played by Ashley Lawrence in the first two films. And he basically comes back to her and makes her a bargain and says, I need to trade places with you. She's been unable to stop pursuing hell as a result of her experiences, and basically promises her that she'll have untold power and be able to remake hell however she wishes. And she reluctantly accepts the bargain and basically becomes transformed as Pinhead becomes slowly human. And she is turned into the new Hell Priest and becomes the new ruler of hell, essentially. And this is, again, written by Clive Barker. These are the comics that continued the canon of the story after the films. So, again, more precedents for having a female villain than a bite in Hellraiser. And I just wanted to show this, but a few years ago, Sideshow Collectibles did this gorgeous this gorgeous statuette of the Hell Priestess, which I think is absolutely amazing. Just look at this thing. Now, if you want to get a hold of one of these things, there is only a limited number made, so like you can't get it anymore through Sideshow. And if you look on eBay, they're like $4,000 from collectors that have them. But man, if I had all the money in the world, I would get one of those. Anyways, so last thing I want to touch on is why you should be watching and interested in The Night House. And how is this connected? I'm going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to get to that right now. Basically, The Night House is written by and directed by the same guys who are writing and directing the new Hellraiser movie. Now, a little bit of interesting backstory is the guys who wrote this movie, years ago, they were in development with Dimension on a Hellraiser film that they wanted to do. They wanted to do a film about a middle-aged woman who is dealing with loss after her husband dies. And then she basically uncovers that he had been into all sorts of occult shit and was digging into hell. And then the Hellraiser stuff comes into it and she uncovers all of this. So a lot of their stuff that they developed for that film that never happened because the Weinsteins didn't want to make it ended up in the Night House. And you can see that. You can see the DNA in this film of the Hellraiser movie that they had possibly intended, but in a different form. Of course, they've worked on the film and made this original story itself, and it's a great little horror movie. I definitely recommend people check it out, but especially if you want to get a little bit of a taste for what you might expect from a new Hellraiser movie, I think this is a really good way to sort of like, get a beat on that. And it's like, okay, I get what these guys are going to be going for. So I definitely recommend check out The Night House. It's a great film. The other thing I just want to point out is that Clive Barker, as of last year, had basically won back the rights to Hellraiser. And it's at the end of this year, I think it's December 21st of this year, the rights revert to Clive Barker for Hellraiser. And that means that anyone who wants to make more Hellraiser basically needs to get Clive Barker's approval. That's good for a lot of reasons, because as we saw before, we had all of these crappy movies, really crappy movies from Dimension Films that were just continuing it so that they did not lose the rights. So Clive Barker having final say over whether or not people get to make a Hellraiser movie, I think that sounds like a good idea. And especially since he has already said that he is on board of this new movie. So he is producing it. Jamie Clayton is your new villain in the movie. And that is where we're going. And I am excited. I hope you are too.